Good morning and welcome back to World Talks, coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Salia Strzemska. Nearly 6 years ago, Belarusians took to the streets after Alexander Lukashenko claimed victory in a disputed presidential election. The protests that followed were the largest in the country's history, but 6 years later, Lukashenko remains firmly in power. So how has Belarusian society changed since then? And what could ultimately bring his regime down? To discuss this, I'm joined by Hanna Liubakova, non-resident senior fellow, the Atlantic Council. Good morning and welcome. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Sally.
So 6 years on from the 2020 election, much of the Belarusian opposition is now operating from abroad. Can you walk us through what happened back in 2020, just briefly?
Of course. In 2020, we had the massive historic protests that never happened in the Belarusian history before, since the independence. We had hundreds of thousands of people every week on the streets for months, despite the immense repression and state terror that the regime unleashed against Belarusians who were peacefully protesting. The main trigger for this protest were the rigged falsified elections by the regime, by Alexander Lukashenko. And of course, Belarusians were against that. Since then, repressions never stopped, not for a day. So we still have people who are being arrested on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. And hundreds of thousands of people left the country. And of course, tens of thousands of people went through the prison system. We still have political prisoners in Belarus, and the number, of course, decreased a little bit, but they're still there. They're still in prison since 2020.
So the new Belarus conference in Warsaw is looking at what comes after Lukashenko, possibly. So what are its main objectives?
I'm actually here right now. You can see I'm in the media room of the conference. So we have several hundred people, around 300 people who gathered yesterday and today, because today is the second day of the conference. And the main discussions are about not only, of course, what will happen after Lukashenko, but also how to make it possible that we will have change in Belarus. So we are discussing pressure, political pressure, sanctions, but also support for civil society, for media, because it's also very important. We're discussing the release of political prisoners, how to make it happen. There are also international partners here. There are embassies, diplomats, of course, donors, right, foundations. So everybody, well, most active people, most active representatives are present here, also including those who were recently released. For example, Ales Bialiatski, Nobel laureate, or Viktor Babaryka, who was very prominent in 2020. Of course, many other figures are also present. So you see that those people who were prominent in 2020, sadly, they were in jail, they were released, now they're back. And they're ready to fight. So they are kind of joining the struggle, the battle, and it's also very important to see. Now the discussions today are about security, are about media, social policies, education. So it's basically about every aspect, right, of society that is important. And yesterday, the important discussion happened also about Ukraine, how to make sure that Belarus, free Belarus, of course, and Ukraine are together and, of course, would fight together to get victory.
Of course, we're going to get to that in a moment. But first, I wanted to ask you, we all know Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, right? But who are the other key political figures in the Belarusian opposition today? And also the reports of divisions within the movement, how serious are these?
Of course, well, there are these prominent figures, as I mentioned, for example, Viktor Babaryka, who was recently released, and that was a great news, of course. He was very prominent in 2020, and actually he's a former banker, and many people joined the movement just because Viktor Babaryka announced that he would start, in the elections, but he was not registered as a candidate. He was arrested. Maria Kolesnikova is another prominent figure. She's this prominent activist, musician, and she she's not here, but she's also very, very active right now. Олесь Beliatsky, Nobel laureate, right? So you see many figures, right, who maybe joined in 2020 or were in the movement since the 90s, since Belarus got independence. And this kind of functions together, but you see some divisions because some people have different ideas of how we get to freedom, right? How we get rid of Lukashenko. Some people say that only dialogue is a solution. Some people say that we should actually increase pressure against the regime. I wouldn't say that these are just different tactical steps. The strategy is the same. The goal is the same. Everyone here wants to get rid of Lukashenko. So this is what counts. And I think I usually joke that there is one place where no disagreements happen is the Belarusian parliament or the Belarusian government. That's where people all agree, with Lukashenko. They don't fight, they don't quarrel, they don't argue. So here there are some arguments, but I think it's good in the end.
So in a recent interview with TVP, Paweł Łatuszka, former Belarusian ambassador to Poland, spoke about the case of Angelika Mielnikowa and Belarusian intelligence operations in Poland. So how serious is the threat that they pose to the opposition, and what do we know about this particular case?
About Angelika Mielnikowa, we don't know many things for sure, right? So there are some things that were revealed recently, for example, that she might be actually in Minsk. And apparently she bought some apartments there, but it's very difficult to confirm unless she, comes out and says that she's in Minsk, right? So we cannot confirm this for sure, but there have been a number of investigations showing that there were some documents, right, that she's there, she bought some apartments. She disappeared more than a year ago. Since then, we don't know what happened to her. She was part of the democratic movement. She joined the Paweł Łatuszka team. That's another prominent figure of the Belarusian Democratic Forces. And she became the speaker of the Coordination Council. The Coordination Council is this parliament that the opposition created. So she became very prominent, right? And then all of a sudden she disappeared. We did not know where she was. And then there were this kind of rumors that she was probably in Minsk. My question here is why, if she is an agent of the KGB, why the regime does not show her? Because it would demotivate people, scare people. What happened to her? Why don't they show her, right? So that's the question. I don't have an answer to that. But regarding threats are real. I think that the regime, if they would have had more resources, I think this campaign against all activists or even media, of course, political figures, would have been even stronger, even more, more effective in a sense, right? They would probably dedicate even more resources to that. But there are this even whole departments at the KGB, and we still have the KGB in Belarus that are working against the opposition in exile. And we know about that. So everybody is, to some extent, under pressure and under threat. Myself, I'm on the wanted list across all the Commonwealth of Independent States. And I know that there are countries where I cannot travel. I was myself sentenced to 10 years in absentia. I was labeled a terrorist in Belarus, even though I'm just a journalist and political analyst. So you see how they're trying to, of course, create divisions between us, but also threaten us so we would not speak out.
Of course, to intimidate people, right? Now, back in Belarus, Lukashenko has been releasing political prisoners recently and seeking sanctions relief from the West. So is this evidence that Western pressure is working? How shall we read that?
There are people who would say that negotiations have worked, but I think that's actually the number of tools here, right? Indeed, we have sanctions that the regime wanted to get lifted. And that's the sort of tool how these negotiations became possible. Another, I think, important aspect here is that the regime probably saw the new administration, the Trump administration 2.0, as this kind of partner with whom they can talk. It's kind of more business-oriented, deal-oriented partner. And that's probably also another factor why these negotiations became possible. But the ultimate goal of the Belarusian regime, of Alexander Lukashenko, is first to get out of isolation, to be recognized as the president and we don't recognize him as a president. And secondly, of course, to get sanctions lifted because he wants to make deals with the EU, with, of course, other international partners without any problems and get money out of it. So I'd say that we shouldn't be blind to these goals and the ultimate goal, his sort of ambition here. And we should remember that, sadly, the number of political prisoners might stay, the same, or they can arrest people more and more, because that's kind of the unlimited resources that the regime has. So they would not shy away from using people as this kind of bargaining chip for getting what they want.
But how much room does Lukashenko actually have to improve relations with the West without upsetting Moscow?
Excellent question. I think that, of course, the regime is very much dependent on Russia in many areas. In the military area, Russia attacked Ukraine in 2022 from the territory of Belarus without probably even asking permission, or maybe, without sort of accepting a no. Secondly, of course, the economy is very much dependent. Foreign trade is basically reoriented to Russia and through Russia, because Belarus now needs Russian ports to sell goods where it's, still possible to sell them. Of course, politically, Lukashenko is very much dependent on Putin, on his support, moral support, diplomatic support, political support, and in the foreign affairs area as well. So the Lukashenko regime became this, +1 to Russia, to whatever Kremlin says, the Belarusian regime usually confirms, right? So there is this kind of an additional vote at the UN, OSCE, and so on. So there, it's very possible to, very kind of difficult to get away from this dependence. And we see how now Lukashenko is trying to maneuver. I don't believe personally that I've been, analytically kind of looking at my country for many years, and I've seen that Lukashenko is always looking up to Putin, right? He had offers from the West before 2020, and I think it was possible to engage more economically with the West, but Lukashenko did not do that. He got scared in 2020, and he immediately ran to Putin to ask for support. So ideologically, mentally, Lukashenko is there. He is with Russia. So it's very, even if, there are these better conditions for the regime to, to open up to the West, I think that Lukashenko will still be with Russia. And here we also have, of course, the war against Ukraine and hybrid threats from the territory of Belarus with the support of Russia. And of course, for the EU, it's very difficult to open up and, of course, to renew this kind of relationship with Belarus, because the regime is just, provoking, attacking, including hybrid threats against the EU. So the EU is being very much cautious here, not to legitimize Lukashenko, not to kind of renew this dialogue with him.
So Belarus today is often compared to Poland during the Solidarity era, but Poland benefited from divisions within the communist regime and crucially from Moscow stepping back at some point, right? So neither is happening in Belarus today. What could realistically create an opening for democratic change?
I usually say that the weaker Putin is, the weaker Lukashenko is, and by the way, vice versa. So I think we are talking a lot about Ukraine winning, right? Ukraine's victory. And this is something that, of course, would definitely make Putin weaker and, naturally, Lukashenko weaker as well. It would also motivate people more. They would see this kind of opening, this window of opportunity. So this is something that would definitely help the kind of pro-freedom, pro-independence, pro-democracy movement in Belarus. On the other hand, I don't think that the democratic movement should only rely on this. I think in the beginning, you mentioned that Lukashenko is kind of firmly holding to power. I don't see this strength. People are still being arrested. It means that Lukashenko feels threatened. Independent media is not allowed in the country. So they're scared of free information. So they are, trying to establish this totalitarian control. They're not able to do that because society is very much looking, for alternative information, and other things. They want reforms. They want something new in the country. They want the country to be more open. And that's why the regime feels threatened as well from the inside. We don't see protests, but the moods are there, right? So society has not given up. Our society has not become this totalitarian society and, very, very controlled by the regime. There is fear, but it's not, this. So we still should be working on maintaining this will to change the country, right? To give people hope inside Belarus. So I think this is what is important. Geopolitical situation, what's happening in Ukraine, and also what the EU does, pressure against the regime, right? Support for civil society, but also how to help people inside the country and kind of maintain this hope there.
And with this, we have to conclude. Hanna Liubakova, thank you so very much for joining us this morning. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.